Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. It's the second time this year that I am in Warsaw, with the same objective, in fact, essentially. So I'm asked to talk about policy responses to labor market duality, how to resolve it. That presupposes that we know the causes of duality, that we also know what is the proper regulation that we want to have in the future, what is the share of informal of atypical contracts that is appropriate. We need to identify the reforms that we need to make in order to reach that desirable regulation, and then we need to know what is politically feasible. Well, the kind of measures we need and what is politically feasible in a country will depend very much on their current institutions. The reforms that we need in Poland are probably much different than the reforms that we have been proposing in Spain or in Italy or in Portugal during the crisis. So that's why I start by acknowledging that no size fits all, right? I'm going to talk mainly about general principles here, and there's going to be an emphasis in the talk, in the second part of the talk, on the so-called unified contract or single open-ended contract, which is part of the proposal that Piotr has prepared for Poland. I'm going to start with very obvious observations. The first thing is that dual labor markets are not the outcome of optimal policy design. Very often labor market reforms, employment protection reforms, are marginal reforms. We introduce flexibility on outsiders and we maintain the rights of insiders. And in some countries, especially in the southern Mediterranean countries, this has led to a very strong dual labor market with separate segments for temporary and permanent jobs. The temporary jobs provide flexibility to firms, but at the cost of a large fringe of unstable jobs. Those reforms are sort of attractive in the short run because of what we call the honeymoon effect. They tend to boost job creation and employment in the short run, but over time we tend to see pervasive distortions. And what is really tough is that the improper use of atypical contracts can spread around very easily. We've seen this in Poland without any noticeable change in regulation. All of a sudden, its use spread around, and then they're very hard to eradicate. So once it's installed, it's very hard to eradicate. Typically in Europe, when we talk about duality, we've been talking about the divide between temporary and permanent workers, or open-ended contracts. But it's useful to use a broader concept of atypical contracts and precarious employment. The use of civil code contracts is on the rise in many countries. Poland is prime among them. And in the crisis-ridden countries, there's also a rise in informal employment. What policymakers should care about is the improper use of atypical contracts. It's not about prohibiting contracts that are not regular open-ended contracts, but it's the use of these contracts that is mainly motivated by cost considerations, pure cost considerations, rather than intrinsic needs of the job or preferences of the worker, right? And we should not forget that regular open-ended contracts should be the default option. What we should strive for is that the vast majority of workers has access under normal circumstances to a regular open-ended contract. But the conclusion of today is going to be there's no such thing like a free lunch. If we want this, we cannot only talk about restrictions on the use of atypical contracts, we have to make the creation of those regular open-ended contracts more attractive as well. Second, these are very obvious considerations, but I want to make them before I start. It is a misconception to think that a more stringent regulation necessarily leads to better protection, because if the regulation is perceived, and I put italics there, is perceived to be too stringent by firms, then they will start to look for loopholes in the regulation to avoid protection, right? And the first victims of this are typically the least productive and most vulnerable workers. So we're imposing a stringent regulation, and in fact we end up protecting only those who would be able to protect themselves relatively well, and we leave without protection those for whom we really want the regulation in the first place. Yeah? Attempts to improve the protection of atypical contracts are bound to produce perverse effects, though, if they're not accompanied by measures to make regular contracts more attractive. I've brought this graph here. Here we look at perceived job security. It's the percentage of people in different countries that declare to be very sure about their future employment. And just to give you an idea, the case of Spain, which had the highest EPL indicator on stringency of EPL, the stringency of EPL on fixed and permanent jobs before the crisis, the percentage is essentially the same as in the US, a country with a deregulated labor market, right? So a very stringent regulation does not lead to a higher proportion of workers that feel relatively well protected. In fact, the country that does best in this perspective is Denmark, with a very lax regulation in terms of EPL. Moreover, if we look at across age categories in Spain, we see that the youth in Spain were the least secure among their counterparts in Europe, whereas the elderly in Spain were the ones who felt most protected of all the elderly in Europe. So there is also a generational aspect here that I have not heard too much about this morning, but it's clearly there. A conflict between youth and old. I think that especially in the south of Europe there is a great consensus nowadays that the dual structure of the labor market has contributed to the perverse behavior or the anomalistic behavior of the Spanish labor market, and that it's important to correct, but dual labor markets are very hard to reform due to the conflict of interest between those who are currently protected and those who need more protection, right? The workers with regular contracts tend to oppose to reforms, and they typically are majority. Unions on their side tend to align with their interests, and the outsiders, on the contrary, unemployed, people on atypical contracts, tend to be very poorly organized. So if you want to move ahead, then government should try to create a level playing field. They should represent the interests of the ones who are not sufficiently represented, the outsiders, right? Nonetheless, we need to care about political feasibility, so we need to get the majority to go along. So we need to compensate them, probably. And that means that we should not be talking about the optimal regulation, we should talk about politically feasible regulations that will not be blocked by the majority. Okay, so in line with what I was asked, I will be talking mainly here about employment protection and the divide between temporary and permanent. At the end, there will be something about Poland, where I will also talk about civil code contracts. Moreover, don't misunderstand me, this morning there was a comment already that the difference between temporary and permanent jobs is not just EPL, it's not just firing costs. Permanent jobs tend to be more rigid in many dimensions, hours, wages. I will have a graph at the or a picture at the end where I'll show this, and I'll compare Poland to Southern European countries. So let me start. So it was brought up this morning already. Temporary contracts in principle can play a useful role. They can be a stepping stone towards permanent employment or open-ended contracts, a way to screen new candidates. But when there is a substantial gap in the level of employment protection between fixed-term contracts and open-ended contracts, they often become a trap. The employer, when he reaches the point at which he has used the maximum number of renewals or the maximum period in which the temporary contract can be used, he needs to decide either to upgrade the worker to a permanent contract or to let the worker go and hire someone else. Now, rotation, that is to say, let your current worker leave and hire a different worker, is more likely to happen when the gap is very high, right? When there are many similar workers in the labor market who can easily be hired and substitute the incumbent worker, right? And when the gains from productivity, from moving someone from a precarious job to a open-ended contract are low. And this therefore mainly affects low-educated workers. The rotation mainly affects youth as well, because they tend to enter the market with an open-ended contract, right? And I want to make clear from the very start that the problem is not the level of employment protection, it's the gap. It's the fact that there is a huge discontinuity imposed by the law, and at some point the firm is forced to evaluate the choice of upgrading a worker to a better contract which has higher costs. And if that gap is very high, then in many instances the firm will prefer to simply rotate the worker. The job is there, the task continues, and I just hire a different worker with similar skills. Here I've tried to show this. It's very unclear for you. On the horizontal axis is the Employment Protection Legislator Index of the OECD, and on the vertical axis is the share of temporary workers. So there's a clear positive correlation. And on the right-hand side, this is the probability of transition, the probability of going from a temporary to a permanent contract. The stricter is EPL, the lower is that probability. And to make it even clearer, I've brought data from Spain. This appeared in an OECD study, where we look at the persistence over time of temporary jobs for workers of different ages and different skill levels. On the left-hand side, you have people with a university degree. So it's clear that, and Spain is the solid line. It's clear that over time, as the worker ages, he has more experience, he has a higher probability of flowing into a permanent job. Spain is everywhere above the rest, except above 55, but it's not that dispar. But if we go to the right-hand side, you look at the low-educated, people with at most secondary education, you can see that at the age of 40, roughly 40%, slightly less than 40% of the workers are still on temporary contracts. Ignacio has estimates, right? If you are, the exact statement is, if you enter the labor market at the age of 18 with a temporary contract, then 40% of those still have a temporary contract. 20 years later, right? So there is enormous persistence. People get trapped into temporary positions, and they don't manage to stabilize. And it's not just youth, it goes on at older ages, and the same is true in Poland. Here we have data on the incidence of temporary jobs by age, and together with Spain, Poland stands out, and especially when we look at the persistence of the use of, or the incidence at least here, of temporary contracts by age. At the micro level, we've already talked about the implications of this trap of temporary or precarious employment. It affects things like fertility, even as we've seen, but there are also important macroeconomic implications that somehow were not stressed that much this morning. Countries like Spain, with a very dual labor market, have much more volatile employment over the business cycle. Firms use temporary contracts as a buffer and fail to explore other channels of adjustment. So when bad times hit, they don't look for wage cuts or adjustments in hours. They simply don't renew contracts of temporary workers. Spain lost 1.3 million jobs in the 6 months after the fall of Lehman Brothers. Low productivity growth, because once you're in a part-time job, neither the firm has an incentive to invest in you, neither you have an incentive to invest in your job. Moreover, countries tend to specialize in low productivity sectors because those are the sectors that thrive well with this kind of contracts. And the third issue, which is probably important for Poland, there are negative fiscal externalities. People flow into and out of unemployment very frequently, therefore you need to devote resources to that. And in the case of civil code contracts, people don't contribute to Social Security, but they probably make a high use of Social Security in the future, right? So it may be a cost gain today, but we may be left with a very high fiscal burden in the future. Now, so what are the policy options if I want to reform? And this is the real question I needed to address today, right? What are the policy options in order to overcome labor market duality? I'm going to focus for the moment simply on employment protection because that's the most Well, it's the hardest part, politically also the most difficult part, and it's an essential part of the reforms. I've listed 3 options. They go from the mildest reform to the most ambitious reform. Where each country is obviously depends on the extent of duality, the depth of it, and the persistence of the use of temporary contracts over the life cycle of a worker. So in countries where only very specific cohorts suffer, very specific groups of disadvantaged workers that do not manage to flow into permanent jobs, we can try to use fiscal incentives, make it attractive for firms to either transform their temporary contract into a permanent one or give hiring subsidies on permanent jobs. Countries that have a generalized problem could first try to reduce the gap in employment protection between temporary and permanent jobs. There's a myriad of ways in which you can do it. We can look at redundancy pay, so we can reduce or equalize redundancy pay across contracts. We can take measures to reduce legal uncertainty in dismissal procedures. Not everything is redundancy pay. Red tape and especially legal uncertainty are important cost components that firms take into consideration when deciding between a temporary or a permanent job. And third, you can put stricter limits on the use of those contracts. Yeah? And then the third one that I'm going to discuss, which is the most ambitious one, is the introduction of a single open-ended contract or a unified contract. Let me go one by one. As I said, fiscal targets, they may serve to improve the access of specific groups of vulnerable workers. Their use may be extended in crisis times, as the OECD has indicated several times, but their widespread use has important disadvantages. Jose Ignacio is one of the experts here. They tend to use substitution effects, so firms hire a worker that is eligible to the subsidy and do not hire a similar worker that is not eligible. Deadweight losses, you're paying those subsidies for workers that would have been hired anyway when the contract is, or when the subsidy is introduced. We have an estimate for the latest subsidy program of Spain that is about 5 billion euros in deadweight cost of a general fiscal credit for hiring workers on permanent contracts. So those can be very substantial. And what is most important, the empirical evidence suggests that fiscal credits, at least in Spain, have at best a modest effect on employment duration. In most cases, the worker is kept on his job until the qualification period for the subsidy expires, and then the firm fires. In a sense, the hiring subsidy is the use of tax money in order to compensate the firm for the fact that he will have to pay redundancy pay when the worker is fired. So you're creating false open-ended positions. Firms create the position to get the subsidy, they end the position the first moment they can. We see this in Spain, and the net effect of this widespread use of hiring subsidies on employment and employment duration is mild, if not almost zero. So we have been throwing away a lot of money on measures that at first sight looked interesting. The second option, as I said, was trying to reduce the gap in EPL between the different types of contracts. The advantage of this is that we're talking about marginal reforms within the existing legal setups. So politically, it's less costly, it's relatively easy to implement. In the case of Portugal, equalized under the pressure of the Troika, equalized redundancy pay on temporary and permanent contracts. So redundancy pay is determined by the duration of the contract, but not by the type of contract. That takes away one of the margins of arbitrage that firms use in order to reduce costs. Spain, on the contrary, opted for a mix of policy, a rather complex mix. We reduced redundancy pay on unfair dismissals. Spain made it easier. It clarified the rules for fair dismissals. The law now stipulates a very clear rule for firms to have access to a fair dismissal. Your results of the firm, so this is sales or benefits, if they deteriorate during 3 consecutive quarters compared to last year, then you have a right to lay off workers. That means they can fall by €1 and you're entitled to layoffs, right? And they have reintroduced a limit on the use of temporary contracts. If we look at the data, it's clear that the reforms have made it substantially cheaper for firms to dismiss workers under fair dismissal. So the share of fair dismissals has increased. It has become easier. But nonetheless, if we look at job creation, still it's about 94% of all contracts that are signed each month are temporary contracts. So those reforms do not seem to have shifted the balance in the decision of firms of what type of contract to create. We have to wait because Spain is in a deep crisis, uncertainty is very high, so there are objective reasons why firms may have a preference, a stronger preference than in regular times for temporary contracts, but those numbers are still unacceptably high. And that brings me to the core, and that is the idea of a single open-ended contract or a unified contract. There are proposals along these lines in many countries, France, Italy, and Spain. I've ranked them here. Various authors are in the room. The terminology single open-ended contract may be somewhat misleading. In Spain, we like to use it a contract with equal opportunities. Kahoot calls it a unified contract, and I'm going to make clear what he means. Let me try to explain what are the common elements between these proposals, and then I give you some specific examples. The basic is the introduction of a new open-ended contract with gradually increasing employment protection. So it's a contract for new hires. At the first stages of the contract, employment protection is similar to the protection that is offered to people on a temporary contract, and then the level of protection slowly increases over time and approaches levels similar to our open-ended position in later years. Both the smooth increase in the level of redundancy pay and the absence of an arbitrary limit on the use of the temporary contract take away much of the incentive to rotate workers, right? There is not now a moment in which you are forced to decide between upgrading the worker to a permanent contract or hiring a different worker, and there is no jump in the level of redundancy pay either. That might have the same result. The idea is that the unified contract or the single open-ended contract becomes the default option in all new hires. In the Italian proposal and the French proposal, in a voluntary fashion, that is to say, we want to make sure that this unified contract is preferred both by employers and by workers to the current set of contracts. And so we do not restrict the use of atypical contracts necessarily there. The original Spanish contract went much further. In a sense, it was imposed. The proposal included the virtual elimination of temporary contracts and replaced that with a single open-ended contract. Let me stress that the rights and entitlements of incumbent workers who already have open-ended contracts are respected. That is to say, we're proposing a solution to this divide between temporary and permanent positions for those who will be hired in the future, leaving the rights untouched of those who already managed to make the jump. From a political perspective, that's obviously very attractive because you're not directly attacking the insiders, but it creates a source of inequality as well. So maybe things become clearer if we look at Spain. The red bars are an indication of an illustration of how employment protection used to work before the crisis. So you could renew workers on temporary contracts for a maximum of 2 years, with an entitlement of at maximum 8 days per week of redundancy pay. If at that point you decide to upgrade the worker to a permanent contract, then in practice redundancy pay would jump from 8 to 45 days per year. There are lower statutory redundancy payments for fair dismissals, but they were essentially impossible for firms to obtain. So there is this wall. The employer hits a wall, and he needs to decide whether he wants to lift up the worker and be exposed to redundancy pay of 45 days a week, or rotate the worker. A new worker that will be under the 8 days rule. Right? And beyond that, in permanent contracts, it's more difficult to change hours, it's more difficult to change wages, right? So EPL is not the only issue. What is the proposal? Well, the proposal, the unified contract would have, it would be open-ended, by default. It would start with redundancy pay very close to the redundancy pay on temporary contracts. It would be growing over time, and then it would somehow reach a level below, and here it's still very high, below the current level. In a sense, we're proposing a gradual scheme that is higher at the start and lower at the end than under the current regime. And the nice thing is, suppose under the hypothetical situation in which we manage to keep the average constant, so the average level of redundancy pay over the lifetime of a worker, this would generate gains. Why? Because we get much less rotation, right? So it's unified because it's open-ended from the start, but it has the characteristics of a temporary job. When we start, it has it obtains the characteristics of a regular open-ended job when time goes by, and there are no discrete discrete jumps in the level of protection. But Spain is an outlier. Before the crisis, Spanish dismissal procedures were secure but extremely costly. Firms essentially circumvented legal control by paying the maximum amount foreseen in the law. There was no mandatory reinstatement of the worker after unfair dismissals. And that's why we simply introduced, the issue here is costs. So we simply introduced a single scheme for all layoffs with economic motives. Later versions, because it was criticized by labor lawyers, foresaw a distinction between fair and unfair dismissals, but the mechanism would be the same because the firm would essentially take the higher of the two schedules and he would circumvent legal control. So under the Spanish example, layoffs were essentially free, but very expensive. And what we've done, we've made them, we've avoided the jump in the costs, and by keeping the average cost the same, we already get gains. If we, on top of that, lower the level of EPL, we would get potentially additional gains. As I said, the original version was very extreme. But it's interesting to think about the menu of contracts, because the more secure is the legal environment, the fewer contracts we need. We see a proliferation of contracts in countries with very rigid regulations that then try to accommodate the specific needs of groups that fall out of the labor markets with specific contractual arrangements. And you keep creating more and more contracts. But if you go to a unified contract, and if legal procedures are relatively secure, you don't need essentially more than just 3 contracts. That is the single open-ended contract, a temporary contract for replacement, and a training contract for the insertion of the youth. Spain currently has over 45, it has 45 different contracts which are now under 5 different titles, but there are still 45 contracts. That could be severely reduced. We could severely simplify regulation, and on top of that, avoid this discontinuity. Let me stress that the single contract could be full-time or part-time. It could be even discontinuous for workers who only work in the season, during the summer season, in the hotel sector, etc. And what is maybe important is it may be necessary to include exemptions for collective dismissals at short tenures to permit seasonal activity. So a farmer that hires 20 persons do not want to be subject to appeals in court when he fires the workers at the end of the season, right? But you can deal with it. So the second main proposal around is the Italian proposal. In Italy, the proposal has a tenure track feature, very common in the academic world. It has an entry phase of up to 3 years in which workers are exclusively entitled to redundancy pay proportional to tenure, but not to legal appeals. It's only in the stability phase that would start after 3 years when the worker is entitled to the existing legal protection against unfair dismissals. And until recently, today or maybe the day after tomorrow, this included the legal right to instatement in large firms. The proposal does not foresee limits on the menu of contracts. So the idea is that the contract offers advantages both to workers. They would prefer this contract over a temporary contract, and firms, right? They have the flexibility of a temporary contract, when the contract is reaches the tenure at which it's comparable to an open-ended contract, it's still more flexible, as we see, because the firing costs were lower in the Spanish case. But here, a possible concern might be, at least my concern, is with the right to instatement, the jump at 3 years is very big still. It's probably too big. So the Italian example will be much more attractive once, and this is under discussion now, the legal right to reinstatement after unfair dismissals is potentially eliminated. Right? Because if I go from the entry phase to the stability phase, I'm not talking just about the fact that redundancy pay may increase a little bit, but I'm really talking about the fact that I might not be able to lay off a worker because Italian lawyers might force me to reinstate the workers with too much probability. Now, there's no such thing like a free lunch. What do we buy? This single open-ended contract offers a much better transition into the labor market for youth. It offers better protection at the early stages of the job, but at the cost of accepting more flexibility later on in life. So we can obviously offer only better protection to workers if we want to avoid adverse effects on employment. We need to compensate the firm. So workers should accept more flexibility later in life. Dismissal procedures should offer a high degree of legal certainty. And internal flexibility should be a viable alternative to dismissals. That is to say, we should make open-ended contracts more flexible. It's not just EPL. It is creating a flexible contract in which hours, wages can be adjusted if there is a need. Yeah? But the bottom line is more security when young in return for more flexibility when old. But you offer this to youth who enter the labor market now, so they know the deal. They know that they'll face more flexibility when they're old, right? So in a sense, this is just a new intergenerational contract, because tomorrow when this elder person is in the labor market, he offers more protection to the young in return for the flexibility when he's old. I'm not asking more flexibility on the current young, on the current old. So it's easier to introduce, but it requires that you, as an older person, accept more flexibility so that your son or daughter has a better entrance, a more secure entrance in the labor market. So in that sense, I'd like to see this as a new intergenerational contract. How much time do you have? Okay. This morning there was already a discussion about instruments. Effective legal protection against unfair dismissals is a basic right of the workers, but we need to think about how we can secure this. And especially if the labor code foresees in very frequent interventions by judges, we may not obtain this objective. Firms are very scared of possible lengthy legal cases, and there are alternatives. We should think what judges are prepared for? Well, judges are prepared to recognize violations of fundamental rights of workers. But what judges are not well prepared for is to recognize whether the economic situation of a firm is such that the firm needs to lay off a worker or not. Right? It's very hard to stipulate contingencies in laws for economic dismissals. Just to give you an idea, in Spain, judges typically think that it's only warranted to lay off when you have losses. But when you have losses, it's already too late. Maybe the firm could have laid off workers before and avoided entering into losses. Judges end up not just verifying the cause, which is stipulated in the law, but very often also the proposed remedy. That is, judges are sitting on the seat of the entrepreneur. And finally, and this is something that I've heard in Poland very often, provisions for fair dismissals normally relate to the economic circumstances of the firm, but under no circumstances contingent on individual performance indicators. So when you're married to someone, well, it's like being married to someone, as this morning was said. When I hire you on a permanent contract, it's very hard to get rid of you unless I pay the highest foreseen redundancy pay. So we need to look for alternative instruments, and Pietro already this morning indicated that redundancy pay is a very efficient instrument. And it also is an instrument of legal protection. It acts as a filter, right? Because it raises the cost of a dismissal, and thereby, if there is a misalignment, if firms do not internalize the costs of firing workers, a redundancy payment can correct this. The redistributive impact can be undone with flexible wages. That is to say, the fact that I have to pay the worker redundancy pay when he is fired, I can offset this at the moment when I hire. So we don't need to have necessarily adverse effects on hiring. And last but not least, it's very predictable. But even redundancy pay is not the only mechanism. We could put a price on the use of atypical contracts. If atypical contracts lead to more insecurity on part of workers and more inflows into unemployment or use of social security provisions, then we should, or maybe want to charge higher social security contributions on them. Experience rating, I leave it for the future. Let me use 1 minute for the Austrian model, and then I round off with a minute on Poland. Here we're still talking about a system in which firms have to pay at the moment when they dismiss a worker. There is an alternative to this. It's called the Austrian model. It's a capitalized redundancy pay system. That is, firms pay into a fund when the worker is at the firm, and the worker can take this fund along with him when he or she has to move to a different firm. So you're anticipating the redundancy pay while the worker is at the firm. At the moment at which you have to dismiss the worker, you don't need to make an outlay. That is, when the firm is going through rough times, it does not have to pay redundancy pay. This corrects an issue that is of concern. That is, severance pay may be correcting market failures, but if it's too high, it also becomes a high disincentive for people to move. So the Austrian system of capitalized redundancy pay eliminates this, because the fund is portable. It does not need to make a distinction between temporary and permanent contracts, so you can pay the same on both. And in the case of Spain, we have defended a mixture. The monetary part of redundancy pay could serve as an insurance against income shocks, and the capitalized part could serve to finance retraining if the worker has to move, or pensions. Right? So it's not just the proposals that are around. We also have to look at the specific instruments that we want to use in order to offer protection. I'm going to skip this because it's, and I'm also going to skip the recent experience. Let me round off by making a few comments on Poland. In my view, duality in Poland is more profound than in Spain due to the widespread use of civil law contracts. I'm not going to enter the discussion how you know the data much better than me, but if I am to believe the reports, all international organizations keep stressing the fact that there's an excessive use of civil law contracts. Civil law contracts expose workers to higher risk than temporary contracts, especially the entitlement to social security, right? And therefore, in principle, require strong measures. And other than temporary contracts, the widespread use of civil code contracts is also a form of unfair competition. Because if you are a firm operating in an industry where many of your competitors shift from labor code to civil code contracts, you in the end may be forced to do the same or leave the industry, right? So there is this risk of a race to the bottom, whereby once a relatively large share of firms in a sector start to use civil code contracts, the rest might just have to follow if they don't want to leave the industry. Again, in the case of Poland, it's not going to be sufficient simply to restrict or prohibit the use of contracts. We must make the hiring under labor code contracts more attractive, notably in the case of the most vulnerable workers. And the first requirement would be to equalize social security contracts across social security contributions across different types of contracts. What we don't want is firms doing arbitrage or workers simply on the basis of social security contributions, choosing the one with the lowest social security contributions. The choice of the type of contract should be a function of the type of job we're talking about and the preferences of the worker, and not by arbitrary differences in social security contributions introduced by the law. Another option might be to introduce conversion clauses. That is, if a self-employed person has a stable relationship with one or a very small set of firms, we might think of converting that relationship into a labor code contract. Do I have more? I don't think so. I think I should just stop. And this is the last thing that I wanted to show. We've been talking about employment protection legislation, but the Polish labor market is inflexible, at least on open-ended positions, in different aspects as well. If you look at the figure here, we have all forms of flexibility. There's hours, wages, and dismissals. And as you can see, at the bottom here, we have the 3 Mediterranean countries, and the next one in line is Poland. So in line with the comments today, if we want to look at solutions to the dual labor market in Spain, in Poland, I think the priority should be that we should get people into labor code contracts rather than civil code contracts. And then if we want to tackle the problem of temporary versus permanent, it seems that the reinstatement of workers is a problem, and that we should also look at internal flexibility of jobs when workers become permanent workers of a firm. That's about everything I wanted to say.
Thank you very much.